As the originators of the concept, it is important to look in detail at British doctrine and designs when it comes to battlecruisers. It's even likely that one should look at them first before the Germans or anyone else, as every other nation built or designed these ships in direct reaction to the British battlecruisers. This is in direct contrast to the concurrent Dreadnought revolution, as the South Carolina class in America was only second to Dreadnought due to how fast the British built their ship. Remember Jackie Fisher? He was fast even in construction, not just in what he wanted ships to do. One can make the argument about the Americans when it comes to battlecruisers, but as mentioned in the Lexington class video, the early American designs prior to Invincible were more big armored cruisers than battlecruisers in the strictest sense. As the general background video, linked in the description, already covered how British battlecruisers were an outgrowth, at first, of armored cruisers, this video will begin by focusing more on the man who pushed hardest for these ships. As mentioned in that video, that man was John, better known as Jackie Fisher. Honestly, I could and really should do an entire video on this man, but for the interests of time, this is going to be long enough to start with, believe me. Suffice it to say that he was a very, I want to say this as kindly as I can, driven sort of officer. When Fisher wanted something, he would latch onto it and push and push and push some more until he got what he wanted. There are stories about him shaking his fist in the face of the British king to get his point across. If you're interested in stories like that, and Fisher the man, I highly recommend reading the books by Robert Massey, specifically Dreadnought. They go into far more detail than I can in any video, even one explicitly about Fisher. That said, in direct relation to battlecruisers, we have a couple important details to cover here. First off, Fisher is tied directly to a specific ship. The second class battleship, which we'll get into the difference between first and second class battleships in a different video, HMS Renown. This was a relatively fast and lightly armored battleship intended for leading overseas cruiser squadrons, though relatively fast was about 19 knots, so you get what you get with the 1890s. That sound familiar? It should. Renown is sometimes considered the origin of Fisher's later desire for fast, lightly armored, and heavily armed warships. Now, she was by no means a battlecruiser, but the connection is hard to miss, especially in light of Fisher himself. The second detail is one that I mentioned in the previous video, that of Fisher wanting to focus entirely on armored cruisers instead of battleships. The interesting quote I mentioned in that video is enlightening, I feel. Of what use is a battle fleet to a country called A at war with a country called B, possessing no battleships, but having fast armored cruisers and clouds of fast torpedo craft? What damage would A's battleships do to B? Would B wish for a few battleships or for more armored cruisers? Would not A willingly exchange a few battleships for more fast armored cruisers? In such a case, neither side wanting battleships is presumptive evidence that they are not much value. Fisher is very wrong here, if you look at history, because everyone built battleships eventually anyway. And honestly, whatever he may have wanted, he couldn't get the Royal Navy to ditch battleships. But it is where his personality comes into play, because when he couldn't get the Royal Navy to ditch battleships, he pushed hard for Dreadnought instead. Dreadnought was arguably Fisher's brainchild and baby in a lot of ways. A ship that focused entirely on getting the most big and long-range guns as possible, and did so by completely shifting away from the pre-Dreadnought, which has that name for a reason, layout of 2 twin turrets and a metric ton of smaller guns of wildly different calibers. Some pre-Dreadnoughts had as many as 5 or 6 different calibers of guns. Just imagine how difficult that is to supply. Of course, Dreadnought will get her own video at a later point. So for now, back to Battlecruisers, which the general video already went over Invincible and her genesis in some detail, so I'm not going to cover her very heavily here. Suffice it to say that Fisher wanted his large armored cruisers and got them. Interestingly, however, he had not yet given up on wanting to get rid of at least traditional battleships. There are design studies from around the mid-1900s-ish showing a fusion design, Dreadnought's firepower with Invincible's speed. A proto-fast battleship, really, though fast is a very relative term in this case, maybe 25 knots at most. Much as with similar ideas over in Germany, this would go nowhere due to cost concerns. It was cheaper to build regular battleships and battlecruisers than a fusion of the two. This desire for cost cutting is, in fact, directly responsible for Invincible's immediate successor. The Indefatigable class, and I know I'm butchering that pronunciation, I apologize in advance, were basically slightly improved Invincibles, for all intents and purposes. In point of fact, the British Treasury only authorized one more battlecruiser under a more penny-pinching government than the one that had authorized Dreadnought and the Invincibles. Indefatigable herself was intended as a one-off, barely improved Invincible. That she ended up with two sisters, Australia and New Zealand, was due entirely to the self-same Dominions funding the ship themselves. HMAS Australia served with the Royal Australian Navy as their flagship, while HMS New Zealand was formerly a part of the Royal Navy proper. New Zealand really couldn't run a battlecruiser back then. These three ships would, alongside the Invincibles, make for a fairly homogeneous six-ship division for the Royal Navy. However, here is where we must leave Fisher and the first two battlecruisers behind and move to the next part of the video. While it might have seemed sufficient at the time, the Indefatigables began to be seen as something of a mistake later in their careers. The concept of repeat Invincibles made a certain level of sense from the viewpoint of cost cutting, certainly. The issue, however, is that it was an ironic mirror of what happened with the Germans and SMS Blücher, as mentioned in the previous video. There, the Germans had built Blücher largely based on the idea of what Invincible was, thanks to British secrecy. That idea of what Invincible was a big armored cruiser that the German ship was perfectly designed to counter as the ultimate armored cruiser. It turned out, of course, that Invincible was armed like a Dreadnought and faster than any existing armored cruiser, excepting Blücher, by some bit. In a similar vein, the British underestimated what the Germans were doing with their battlecruisers. SMS Von der Tann was not expected to be as fast as Invincible, but with substantially more armor. The even newer Moltke class was yet heavier armored and faster still. The British had built 3 ships on the expectation that Invincible's superiority to foreign designs remained, when in fact it had already lapsed. This is why the ships were considered something of a mistake, as they were arguably obsolescent even as they were finished. Certainly still capable warships, but no longer superior to what the Germans were doing. Interesting side note here. The Indefatigables had less armor than the Invincibles in terms of armor coverage, if not raw thickness. So one could argue they were inferior ships, if your focus is entirely on armor protection. When the specifications of the German ships leaked, alongside general German construction plans, to the British press, well, that sparked the now infamous naval arms race between Britain and Germany. A panic about the Germans surpassing the British was never going to happen, but logic has never been a strong point of tabloids pushing an agenda, prompted the rapid increase of British ship construction. Never one to miss a chance, our old friend Fisher decided to push for no less than 8 battlecruisers, as 8 capital ships were, in general, being pushed on the Royal Navy. As one could probably expect at this point, the Royal Navy went, no, and authorized 3 battleships and 1 battlecruiser, with a further 3+1 as an expansion option. Those battleships would be split between the Colossus class and the Orion class. The former were the last of the 12-inch British battleships and the end of the incremental improvements on Dreadnought concept of design. The latter, the Orions, were the first super dreadnoughts armed with the new 13.5-inch gun and featuring all of their turrets on the center line instead of the wing turrets of previous ships. Now, this is something I need to make note of, as it's where we enter the second generation of British battlecruisers. The Splendid Cats, as they were called. HMS Lion and Princess Royal were the two battlecruisers ordered during this period. As I made note of in the background video, at this point, the battlecruisers are beginning to move from their genesis as large armored cruisers, at least in concept if not in real design, and into something more akin to the same year's battleship but with sacrifices for speed. For example, the Lion class were built with the same 13.5-inch guns as the Orions, and more or less the same layout. That's why I said that was important. There was some level of grumbling about how the Lions only went for one super-firing pair of turrets instead of having both of them do that. That is, for those unaware, having one turret mounted above the other. If you look at most battleships past a certain point, like look at the Iowas, their front two turrets, those are super-firing. Orion had 4 turrets mounted in such a way, with a 5th turret on the center line because this is the time of the turret farms. One of the sacrifices that Lion had to make for her speed, though, was cutting out one of those turrets in favor of only mounting 4 twins. The problem, to some people, was that the aft pair was separated by some superstructure. The general assumption here is that it was done for cost saving. Hello, our old friend. And for reasons of blast impact on the lower turret. Don't get me wrong here, the latter was an actual problem, since at the time the British were insisting on mounting their siding hoods. That's where you would look out of the turret, on the top of the mountings, on top of the turrets, which was, if you'll excuse the sarcasm, shall we say, not the best for avoiding blast effect from big honking guns going off right over your head. Anyway, with the Lions, the concept of a British battlecruiser began to move away from big armored cruiser, intended to function solely as a scout and commerce raider, or protector, and towards a battleship with less guns and armor. It was the year before the Lions were laid down, in 1908 actually, that Fisher first called these ships battlecruisers. In 1911, the Royal Navy made that official, as a way of differentiating the battlecruisers from the older armored cruisers, in a reflection of this change of doctrine and concept. As I said before, they changed from big cruiser to capital ship. The Lions are the perfect reflection of this change in concept and doctrine, as these ships increased in armor and firepower in direct counter to the German ships. It is here, perhaps, where the British began to see these ships as useful in the line of battle. Another quote I have is revealing in this regard. Battlecruisers. The primary function must be that of engaging the battlecruisers of the enemy. There are many reasons for this, the most important being that, owing to their great power and speed, battlecruisers, if not in the line of battle, can force all inferior vessels to give way, and, consequently, if the enemy's battlecruisers are not held, their power to inflict damage on ships of weaker types is unchecked. I should note this is only part of a larger quote given by the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet in 1913, George Callahan. The rest of the quote is about how battlecruisers, in the absence of enemy equivalents, would either be used as a fast division of the battle fleet or at the discretion of their commanding officer. The general point here, and why I picked the first half of the quote, is that battlecruisers, in the absence of the enemy, are becoming something intended as a direct counter to that enemy, or as a wing of the battle fleet, if they aren't there. No more were they intended to hunt cruisers or take the place of armored cruisers on foreign stations. They are not cruisers anymore. They're full-on capital ships. Doctrines change and develop, and as the enemy builds different things and you need to counter them, you just have to adapt, and that's what the British were doing with their second generation of battlecruisers. With the Splendid Cats, the British were arming and armoring their ships against German 11-inch armed battlecruisers. Ships intended to fight and tie down enemy battlecruisers or join the line of battle as required. No longer were they just ship with battleship guns, armored against cruisers, and faster than anything that can outgun them. This is why I'm trying to get a point across here. People think of battlecruisers like that, but it's really only the first generation. After that, they completely change. As far as Lion herself and the half-sister Queen Mary, I'll go over them in more detail in later videos, actual ship overviews. For now, we'll move on to the last of the pre-World War I battlecruisers and the last of the second generation. That ship is the most beautiful battlecruiser ever built, according to some people. HMS Tiger. Tiger was, in many ways, the final expression of the second generation of battlecruisers. She had the same 8 13.5-inch guns as the Lions, though admittedly of a different design. Her armor was further improved, though still lesser than German designs. Her speed was increased even further. She got close to 30 knots on a good day, which is actually quite a bit faster than most other battlecruisers to this point. But her biggest break from the previous ships was finally swapping to a more logical gun layout. Mind you, she still didn't go completely super firing. Her fore turrets, just like on Lion, were super firing. Her aft turrets were not. This was because her power plant took up space that prevented such a layout. You see similar things with the German Derflingers or the Japanese Congos, which Tiger heavily resembles. That said, her aft turrets were no longer blocked by her superstructure and had a full firing arc aft and improved arcs forward. So she may not be quite modern yet, but she's substantially better than the other Splendid Cats are here. This improvement was notable, however, as it does not justify moving her past second generation to my mind. Tiger still has the same features of that generation, even if they're improved. The relatively better armor, the heavier firepower, the similarity to that year's battleships, in her case the Iron Dukes. She's improved in every way, but it's still the same concept. She's still the ultimate expression of her generation, but not a substantial change from her generation. Part of this is because she's the last of the pre-war battlecruisers. Part of it's just the way the designs worked out. Either way, Tiger was the last of that generation. And the third generation is when you get into World War I and the next evolution in British doctrine. Believe me, the third generation is interesting in just about all the wrong ways. It's going to be fun covering those ships. That being said, this is getting to be a fairly lengthy video as it is. So I will split this here, and on Sunday, I will upload the second half of this video, covering the Renowns and the large light cruisers. And believe me, those ships are not called large light cruisers for no reason. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time covering the third and fourth generations of British battlecruiser.